Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. Before we let me bring our guest on. Hi, Vern. Just a couple of announcements before we start. On April 13th, next week at noon, Lunch with Books live stream. We'll take a look at a new book called On the Plains in '65, the 6th West Virginia Cavalry in the West by, it was George Holliday's memoir edited by Glenn Longacre. And Mr. Longacre will be with us next week at noon. I also want to mention that you see the URL for the pbs.org site/Hemingway, where you can watch the trailer for the series. I hope you watched the first one last evening. They're also having a book club on, it's Wednesday at 8 p.m., and it'll be hosted by the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, and will feature Ken Burns and the other filmmakers that evening. And they have currently a online exhibition of Hemingway's life at the same URL. Just go and search for it. Now, let me get my reading face on. I'll introduce our guest for today. Dr. Verna Kale earned her PhD from Penn State in 2010 with specialization in 19th and 20th century American literature and textual scholarship. She is assistant research professor in English at Penn State University and associate editor of the Hemingway Letters Project. She also serves on the executive board of the Hemingway Society. She was interviewed for the PBS documentary and is the author of Ernest Hemingway, Reaktion Books 2016. This biography offers a reconsideration of one of the most important figures of American arts and letters, and isn't that what this entire thing is about, really? Here is Dr. Verna Kale.
And let me go ahead and share my screen with you. I have some slides I want to share. Okay, and so hopefully everybody can see my title slide there. I'm glad you came out. I look forward to talking about Hemingway with everybody, and I was honored to serve as a program advisor on the Hemingway documentary directed by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. And I also interviewed for the film. So if you saw part 1 last night, I wasn't in that part, but I think I'm in part 2 tonight. So I hope you'll join me for that. And I'm going to be talking today about Hemingway's life and work, and referencing the biography of Hemingway that I wrote. I'm also happy to talk about the Hemingway Letters Project, the ongoing project to produce a scholarly comprehensive edition of all of Hemingway's letters, probably 17 volumes total. We're up to volume 5 right now. Volume 5 was published last summer. I'm the associate editor of that project, which is headquartered at Penn State and directed by Sandra Spanier. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have as best I can at the end of the talk. So this presentation is called The Life and Work of Ernest Hemingway, which is actually kind of a daunting task to take on. So rather than trying to boil Hemingway's entire biography and literary output down to 30 minutes, which would be an impossible task. Even Ken Burns couldn't manage that. They set out to make 1 episode and ended up making 3. I've decided to focus on Hemingway's early life and career. And I've picked out several of the common misconceptions about Hemingway that I hear most often, and I want to offer you a new perspective on them. I'm going to share with you some new ways of thinking about Hemingway's mother, Grace, 2 of his early losses, the heartbreak over losing Agnes and his heartbreak over losing his suitcase full of manuscripts. And I'm going to conclude with a suggestion that we pay a little bit more attention to Hemingway as a nonfiction writer rather than as an author who defied, not think of him as an author who was just a novelist who sometimes wrote nonfiction, but rather someone who was also a nonfiction writer as much as he was a novelist. So Let's see. Before we get to the misconceptions, though, I want to talk about the challenge of biography in general and sort of refute the idea that there is any such thing as uncovering the real so-and-so. So I think that one thing that governs the way I approached writing my book, and also that really comes through beautifully in the film and in the letters, is that there's no single objective truth about who Hemingway really was. He was a complicated person. And I mean, everybody is a complicated person, but Hemingway was really complicated. There's a great quote in the film of his first wife, Hadley, that Hemingway had so many sides, he defied geometry. And I think that that's really true. And I also think it's really interesting that he used a similar metaphor to describe his own writing. So in Green Hills of Africa, a nonfiction novelistic account of his safari, he says that writing, that he has to live life to the fullest in order to write. But without writing, there's no enjoyment in living. And so he's in pursuit of a fourth and fifth dimension in writing, a prose that has never been written. And on this next slide, we have Gertrude Stein in Paris, 1924, with Gotti, which is her nickname for her godson, Bumby, Hemingway's first child with his wife, Hadley. Even in Hemingway's own day, his complexity was understood by those who knew him. Gertrude Stein said, I love this quote. This is from the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. He looks like a modern and he smells of the museums, but what a story, that of the real him, and one he should tell himself. What a book would be the real story of Hemingway, not those he writes, but the confessions of the real Ernest Hemingway. It would be for another audience than the audience Hemingway now has, but it would be very wonderful. I teach my students this in our writing classes, that objectivity is not the goal. Objectivity, if objectivity is your goal, you're setting yourself up for failure and for boring writing. What we want to do is we want to research, we want to verify and confirm information. And I'm a huge proponent of teaching students to do archival primary source research. But also, there's a story to tell, a way of shaping the information. And a lot of that depends on the teller and the audience. And Hemingway's still relevant today because he's so complicated. It's not just about finding out new information. There is a new Hemingway to discover, and it takes a 21st century biographer or filmmaker to find it, and it takes a 21st century audience to appreciate it. And so I know you maybe came today because you already know about Hemingway and you're hoping to learn more. So you might be surprised to know that more and more often the students in my classes haven't heard of him, or they have, but they don't really bring with them that myth of Hemingway. And I actually kind of find that refreshing. Michael Katakis says in the film that he hates the myth of Hemingway, and I do too. The student's fresh perspective enlivens the way that I understand Hemingway. And I think that that's one reason that there are endless biographies about him, and that there's room for a new documentary and for this multi-volume comprehensive edition of letters. And he's endlessly captivating. And so today I want to take up a few of the points that in my book and in the letters and in the PBS film offer these reconsiderations of what we previously thought we knew about Hemingway. And this next slide is a family photo of Hemingway with his mother and father and brother and sisters. Hemingway grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, and one area of his life that I think the major biographies have not exactly gotten wrong, but tried to make coherent when real life isn't coherent, is the relationship with his parents. They've often been portrayed as very moralistic, very conservative, and it's assumed he got a lot of valuable life lessons on the natural world from his father, but that they didn't really appreciate his work, and that his mother, Grace, especially has been vilified in these biographies, probably because Hemingway himself vilified her. He does say some nasty things about her in his letters, and I won't quote them because this is a public library talk, and maybe don't want to use that kind of language. But he didn't have nice things to say about her. But of course, again, there's more to it than that. And there's a letter published in volume 2 of the letters that is also quoted in the film, where Hemingway is trying to explain to his parents that that he's attempting something new. He wants them to understand what he's trying to do. He writes, and I'm sorry, I'm not Jeff Daniels. I can't read his letter so evocatively, but I'll try. The reason I have not sent you any of my work is because you or mother sent back the In Our Time books, and that's his first short story collection. That looked as though you did not want to see any. You see, I'm trying in all my stories to get the feeling of the actual life across, not to just depict life or criticize it, but to actually make it alive, so that when you have read something by me, you actually experience the thing. It is only by showing both sides, 3 dimensions, and if possible, 4, that you can write the way I want to. So when you see anything of mine that you don't like, remember that I'm sincere in doing it and that I'm working towards something. And so there you see again this metaphor of the complicated geometry. And there are some other letters where he says he wants the people in Oak Park to read his stuff and see what he's doing. Now, he wasn't going to pander to them. He kind of wanted to blow the tastes of Oak Park wide open. But there's a desire there to make his parents proud. And we need to look more closely at the environment in which he grew up and see how it affected him as an artist. And here I want to give his mother, Grace, a lot more credit than she has been given. She's often been portrayed as being kind of selfish. At one point, she wanted to build a cabin at Walloon Lake as a studio for herself, and there was some family conflict over that. She was the breadwinner in the family, giving music lessons. She later was a very competent painter, which again drew some negative remarks from Hemingway. But like I said at the beginning, I want to bring a 21st century perspective to this. None of that about Grace is inherently bad, because she wasn't doing that and neglecting the family. She was an independent woman, ahead of her time, a type of new woman. She was a doting mother. And we can kind of get a sense of her as a doting mother when we look at her scrapbooks, which that's on this next slide. The scrapbooks, which you can view on the website of the Kennedy Presidential Library's Hemingway collection, and they're also featured in the film. They're basically the equivalent of a mom in the early 2000s having a mommy blog, or today being on Instagram. Cute photos, cute sayings, proud moments, memorabilia, it's all there. And we know that Hemingway was reciting poetry by Tennyson and Longfellow, and going to plays and learning a musical instrument from a young age. And that's all thanks to Grace. Another thread that the film picks up on is the idea that's kind of controversial in Hemingway studies about the kids being dressed alike, sort of twinned. And that's not one that I focus on so much in my book, but it's kind of interesting, and the film does pick up on this thread. And Grace would dress them alike for pictures, sometimes both as boys, sometimes both as girls. And this gets a lot of attention in some of the biographies, and then it also gets some backlash from respondents who say, oh no, that was totally normal for the time period for boys to be wearing gowns. And again, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere a little blurrier. And I have kind of a different perspective on this. I see this as being a creative outlet for Grace, styling the clothes, creating a little narrative, using photography, putting it into the scrapbook. If we want to talk about how this dress-up influenced Hemingway's writing, I'm less convinced that it led directly to the Garden of Eden, which is his posthumously published novel about fluid gender roles, than it did to him just wanting to be a writer. to having a sense of make-believe, to understanding that people can have ways of being that are performance. And so it seems to me that this was a household just full to the brim with art, music, poetry, stories, science. Today we call that STEAM. And as his parents were generally conservative in that they didn't really appreciate stories without what they would have considered like a moral center, but they weren't conservative in their willingness to see him attempt writing as a career. Grace's career as a professional musician had fallen short, but I think we need to understand that Hemingway owes a lot of what he became because of, and not despite, this upbringing in Oak Park. So the next slide is a painting of Hemingway that Grace made in 1925. And she did this after a 1923 photograph of Hemingway by the famous modernist photographer Man Ray. And Hemingway may have given this photo to his parents as a Christmas present. Stylistically, it's a departure for her because she was primarily a landscape painter. But I think it's interesting that this photo, modern technology, a modernist sensibility of composition, appealed to her. And I also think it's touching that she chose as her subject her son. And so I like this painting. I think it kind of complicates the story that later biographers would tell of her, or that Hemingway would himself tell years later. All right, moving on. I would next like to touch briefly on two of the earliest losses in Hemingway's life. First, the loss of Agnes von Kurowski, the Red Cross nurse he fell in love with after he was wounded in Italy during World War I. And second, the famous suitcase theft. And you'll see, I hope, how these things are sort of related. Hemingway was devastated when he returned from the war and got the letter from Agnes breaking off their engagement. And the age difference, she was 7 years older, didn't bother him, but it did concern Agnes. And her breakup letter is just, it makes me cringe a little bit. She says, "I am still very fond of you, but it is more as a mother than as a sweetheart. I can't get away from the fact that you're just a boy, a kid." Oh, yikes. Agnes has largely been portrayed as a free spirit, and Hemingway also sort of drew upon her for some of his writing. The character in a very short story kind of makes her out to be sort of a social climber who dumped her American boyfriend when an Italian officer comes along. It's a little bit of a bitter story. But Agnes probably had Hemingway's best interests at heart. And she later said in an interview that she wanted to protect him. She wanted to see him get back home to work on his career and not fall into the expatriate life, bumming around Europe with wealthy friends. And so Hemingway goes back home. He then kind of falls into a fairly quick courtship with another older woman. This would be Hadley, who did marry him. Shortly after he married Hadley, and this is kind of interesting. This is the part of the story that a lot of people don't know. Shortly after he married Hadley, he wrote to Agnes. So this would have been in, I think, 1922. Agnes wrote back. Nothing really came of the exchange. They sort of caught up with each other. But it's interesting to me that he fictionalizes this in The Snows of Kilimanjaro. And in that story, in one of the flashbacks, the dying writer, who's the protagonist of that story, remembers sending a letter to an old girlfriend. And in the story, the setting of that flashback happens during the Greco-Turkish War. Okay, so that would be 1922. So that would be the year that Hemingway wrote Agnes. So we have Hemingway remembering Agnes in 1922. And then again, remembering her in the 1930s when he writes that story about remembering her in 1922. But that's not the end of it either. And there's this interesting letter in the files at Knox College that this letter was written by a guy named Mike Murphy, but he reported this information back to Hemingway. So we have this sort of archival evidence that In 1957, Hemingway again kind of went looking for Agnes. This is sort of the 1950s equivalent of like looking up your old boyfriend on Facebook or something. So he seeks her out again. The Red Cross responded to the inquiry to say that she's now married and living in Key West, and their response is actually really interesting too, because they talk about how what a good nurse she was. She went on to have a really amazing nursing career. Really helped a lot of people. So that's only 100 miles away from where Hemingway was living in Cuba. But as far as we know, he didn't get in touch with her. But that loss was not easily forgotten. And I'm kind of connecting this then to the suitcase theft. And I kind of want to flip that around and say that the suitcase theft loss, I think, is one that has actually been overstated a little bit. And let's go to the next slide. So the loss that has been overstated is the suitcase theft, which also happened in 1922. That was kind of an important year for Hemingway. Hemingway was on assignment in Lausanne, and Hadley was going to join him, and hoping that he could get some work done. She, packed up all his work in progress in a valise that was then stolen from her at a Paris train station, and he lost almost every bit of his creative work in progress. And in A Movable Feast, his memoir, he makes it sound as if when he met her train and found her distraught, he turned around and went back to Paris immediately. And he says ominously in that memoir, "I remember what I did in the night after I let myself into the flat and found it was true." I want to point out, too, that it was around this time that the couple likely conceived their child. And as a biographer, we sometimes do odd things. And one of the slightly weird things I did was I took Bumby's birthday and plugged it into one of those reverse ovulation calculators that you can find on the internet. And I'm pretty sure that he was conceived right around the time the suitcase got stolen, which is kind of interesting. Make of that what you will. But, in reality, what happened after he found his work gone is maybe a little bit less dramatic. So in the PBS film, we kind of see that as a 1-2 punch, like, oh no, she's pregnant, and oh no, she lost all his stuff. But I think, again, the truth here is a little slipperier. The theft occurred on December 2nd, 1922, but the first mention of it in Hemingway's letters isn't until January 23rd, 1923, when Hemingway tells Ezra Pound, "I suppose you heard about the loss of my juvenilia. I went up to Paris last week to see what was left." And that's kind of all he really says about it. He kind of says, "Don't tell me it was for the best. I don't want to hear it." But in that letter to Pound, he doesn't sound totally distressed either. And then later in A Movable Feast, he kind of equivocates on whether the loss was instructive or destructive. He says, "It was probably good for me to lose early work trying to lie, but I knew it was true." And so Hemingway is now forced to take Stein's writing advice to him about his now lost first novel, begin over again and concentrate. And Hemingway would indeed start over. He had a few pieces out for consideration. His poetry, which is, not great, but it was something. His poetry had helped him get a foothold in the artsy little magazines, and he was able to reconstruct some of the more experimental pieces that he had been working on. The loss of the novel was probably a good thing. I'm sure it was painful for him. But he knew at this point, he knew that if he wanted to move on from little magazines to a professional career, he needed to write a novel. And so what I'd like to focus on now isn't the story of how he broke his contract with Bonnie and Liveright, the publisher of his short story collection, because I think that story is fairly well known and more or less accurate. But I'd like to suggest that we might not be paying enough attention to Hemingway as a writer of creative nonfiction. And I think it surprised people to learn in the letters that Hemingway was thinking of writing a book like Death in the Afternoon, which is his nonfiction bullfighting book, from the very beginning of his career. So Hemingway saw his first bullfight in 1923, and right away he was captivated. And in fact, in the very letter in which he writes to Maxwell Perkins to express his regret that he had signed with Bonnie and Liveright for In Our Time, and he promises Perkins if he's ever in a position to send Scribner's anything to consider, he will. He tells Perkins what he has to in mind to write. And I think it's really important we keep in mind that he's not Hemingway yet. You know, he's not famous. He's got some clout among the expats in Paris, but he isn't known in New York yet. He doesn't really know Maxwell Perkins. Perkins doesn't really know him. But what he pitches here is, as he attempts to describe it, a sort of Doty's Arabia Deserta of the Bull Ring, a very big book with some wonderful pictures. So that's what Hemingway pitches to Maxwell Perkins. So he also jokes in this letter that one has to save all winter to be able to bum in Spain in the summer, and writing classics, I've always heard, takes some time. But he's not joking when he says, somehow I don't care about writing a novel, and I like to write short stories, and I like to work at the bullfight book. So I guess I'm a bad prospect for a publisher anyway. Somehow the novel seems to me to be an awfully artificial and worked out form. But as some of the short stories are now 8,000 to 12,000 words, maybe I'll get there yet. And of course, we know he did get there with The Sun Also Rises and then A Farewell to Arms. And on this next slide, we can see a caricature of Hemingway that appeared in Vanity Fair in 1928. So his sort of public persona was well known. It went hand in hand with his rising literary star. He also was sort of a rising, familiar personality in the media, at least in the media of, people who are on the inside track. So Death in the Afternoon is a very long, very detailed book about bullfighting that he would publish in 1932. And he claimed in a 1930 letter to have been working on a book on the bullfight for some years. So he must have had this idea bouncing around in his head ever since he, first wrote to Max Perkins about it. It wasn't until 1930 that he began working on it steadily and really started drafting it. But once he got started, he poured himself into this work. He published an article-length piece about the bullfight in the March 1930 issue of Fortune magazine. And this started as 21 typewritten pages with an additional 10 pages in pencil footnotes. And he told Archibald MacLeish, I think the footnotes are a good idea as they give juice to supplement the fact. And I just want to point out that, copious footnotes like this is something that you'll see called innovative almost 75 years later when someone like David Foster Wallace does it. The editors at Fortune apparently didn't appreciate it, though, because Fortune published the footnotes as an appendix. But Hemingway described the article to MacLeish as being facts, not literature. But then when the expat publisher Edward Titus wrote that he had heard Hemingway was working on a history of the bullfight, Hemingway replied, "Am not writing a history is much more complicated." So in addition to appendices and a glossary, the book has lots of photos, which were very expensive to publish. And even then, it had a lot fewer photos than Hemingway originally wanted. And in addition to the instructive information about bullfighting, the book included these sort of ruminations on the craft of writing. And some of this is done through a dialogue with a character called the Old Lady, who sort of represents the reader. So Hemingway's sort of talking to the reader in the book as he's writing it. And this is a metafictional passage that sort of blurs the line of fiction and nonfiction and also blurs the lines of genre. And so it's here in the book that Hemingway most famously lays out his iceberg theory of writing, which is that the writer can and must know what is happening in the parts left out of the book. So if the writer knows what's in that bottom 7/8 of the iceberg and just gives the reader that top 1/8, he says the reader should be able to sense them. as being true. And so, not surprisingly, his audience, which had been, clamoring for a novel to follow up on The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, they didn't quite know what to make of this strange, long book about a very foreign subject. And the critics seemed to appreciate it, but it also kind of confused them. And Fanny Butcher, who was a critic for the Chicago Tribune, called Hemingway an authentic genius for this book. But the New Yorker reviewer called it a strange book, childish here and there, bitter, and even morbid. And so, of course, Hemingway doesn't take criticism particularly well. And as you'll see in part 2 of the documentary tonight, which talks a little bit about this kerfuffle he got into with Max Eastman. Eastman criticized Death in the Afternoon, and Hemingway spoiler alert, hits Eastman with a book in Maxwell Perkins' office. So to say he didn't take criticism well is kind of an understatement. He was also a little bit disappointed in the sales of the book, but the American interest in the bullfight spectacle has to be generated by Hemingway. So he sort of had to create the audience for this book with the book, and that's a difficult task for a writer to do. He did manage to do it, though. Bullfighting imagery would start cropping up in men's magazines throughout the next couple decades, as sort of part of this larger mainstream modernist ethos that Hemingway, more than any other writer, was able to tap into. But he wasn't yet finished with nonfiction, much to Maxwell Perkins' chagrin. So Hemingway caused Max Perkins quite a bit of worry because, Perkins really loves the novels that Hemingway writes, and he wants to keep publishing them. Hemingway's his star writer, living down in Key West, and, Hemingway then throws himself body and soul into the sport of deep sea fishing. So, just when Perkins can feel a little bit of relief that the bullfight book is done with, and, his star writer can get down to the work of writing the next novel, Hemingway starts writing him letter after letter about fish and even makes him come down to Florida to join in the fun. And as you'll see in the film, Maxwell Perkins, who was kind of a straight-laced guy, when he goes fishing, he's wearing his suit and tie to go fishing. There's kind of some funny photos from when Max Perkins joined their fishing expeditions. But Hemingway was serious about fishing. It wasn't, and this is another misconception about him, that he was some sort of loafer. That's not it at all. He throws himself passionately into the sport of deep sea fishing. So, in 1933, Hemingway writes Ezra Pound, and he jokes that he might become a naturalist. But, he kind of wasn't joking, not entirely. He was learning everything he could learn about deep sea fishing in the Gulf Stream. And he was so enchanted with it that he was even willing to postpone the African safari that he had been dreaming about since he was a little kid. But in 1932, he writes to Charles Thompson, who's supposed to accompany him on this safari. He writes, "It occurred to me that it might be okay to suggest to Uncle Gus, who was going to pay for their safari, that we should go to Africa next June and meantime work out this aguja business." And so aguja is the Spanish word for billfish, meaning marlin. So work out this aguja business while we're still pioneers. We have a unique position pioneering this. There are new species never before classified, can do new and valuable work besides the wonderful damned excitement with which you are familiar. And, so Hemingway's serious. He's working with scientists from the Academy of Natural Sciences to classify these new species. He's living this dream of pioneering something, being an explorer. So you can see why Hemingway's excitement about fishing caused Perkins some, degree of worry. And so in 1934, which is now 5 years removed from A Farewell to Arms. Perkins writes Hemingway, he says, "For God's sake, don't get to be too much of a naturalist or you won't have time to write." And he expresses this hope that Hemingway is working on a novel. And Hemingway had kind of alluded to he was writing a long thing, and Perkins was like, "Yay, a novel." No, it wasn't a novel again. Hemingway's working on Green Hills of Africa, which is, again, about, in the way that Death in the Afternoon had been, as much about writing and the writer's pursuit of immortality as it is a man's pursuit of a kudu. And I just want to leave off here with the idea that we might look more closely at Hemingway's work, like Death in the Afternoon and Green Hills of Africa, and consider them as creative nonfiction. And so that's a genre that didn't even have a name yet when Hemingway was writing, but his use of secondary material, narrative, meta-commentary, all of these innovative things, they're sort of anticipating the genre that's very popular today. And so instead of seeing them as something Hemingway did when he wasn't writing novels, I suggest that we recognize the strenuous lifestyle he led, the hunting, fishing, the bullfight, even, if to our sensibilities today, these activities are kind of questionable, that we look at that and the work that came out of that life as an essential part of his creative output, and not, an anomalous passion project that he worked on when he otherwise had writer's block. So there's a lot left to discover about Hemingway in the archives and also just in these works that he left for us. I've touched on just a few points here about some new ways that we can look at his early relationships and his experimentation with genre. But I hope I've been able to give you a few new ways of seeing Hemingway and his work. And so I'd like to end my talk here and with the closing passage from Death in the Afternoon. And it is kind of metatextual, but I think it's a nice way to kind of conclude the points I've been making. So Hemingway writes, "The great thing is to last and get your work done and see and hear and learn and understand and write when there is something that you know and not before and not too damn much after." And then he says, "It," meaning Death in the Afternoon, "it is not enough of a book," which is kind of a funny way to end your book. But there were a few things to be said. There were a few practical things to be said. And I hope you feel the same way about what you've learned here today. And I thank you for listening. And I would love to answer any questions that you have about Hemingway's life and work.
Hello, very nice presentation. Thank you. Let me put this one up because it was a theme recurrent throughout the documentary, which is this, the death theme, which is going to come back, obviously. So I wonder what you thought of that. And I'm thinking in particular of I think it was Indian camp when the boy said that sitting in the boat, he didn't think he would ever die.
Yes, that is definitely one of the most important themes that runs throughout all of Hemingway's work. And there's a couple ways of looking at that. One is just to, kind of take the biographical approach and, recognize that Hemingway, from a very young age, experienced, possibly a near-death experience when he was blown up on the banks of the Piave River. There's that beautiful passage in A Farewell to Arms where he writes about the Frederick Henry feels, what might be his soul leaving his body. And the image Hemingway uses is like a silk handkerchief being pulled from a pocket. And that's just an amazing image. And then the soul goes back in, and Frederick Henry is sort of left with this knowledge that, there's more to things than that. When you die, you don't just die. We see that picked up again at the end of For Whom the Bell Tolls, where, Hemingway chose as the title for that novel, he goes to that John Donne poem, No Man is an Island. Everybody's sort of part of a larger whole, and one person's death is not that it doesn't matter. It's that one person's death is every person's death. And to me, like 1 year ago, March 2020, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. I thought about that, and it really resonated, that idea that we're all part of the main. And Hemingway drew from that John Donne poem to express that idea. But then death also shows up in his work in a more almost cynical way. This idea of life as a fixed race, that everybody's going to lose. And that shows up in A Farewell to Arms as well, where he talks about, it kills us all. And, there's the title of his short story collection, Winner Take Nothing. Even if you're good at life, it's going to get you. So it's going to kill the brave. It's going to also kill the cowards. Everybody, no one's going to make it out of here alive. He writes beautifully about these topics, but, it is kind of dark. And you have to, when you read his work, you realize like, oh, this is a man who from a very young age experienced, this trauma, and it stuck with him. And he then shared it with us. And I think that's part of his appeal, because, there is this idea that there's this, we're all in this together, and, we got to do what we can do with the time that we've got.
Yeah, you mentioned his youth, how much he accomplished before he was 30, really. It's kind of amazing. One of my questions, and then we'll go on to another one, was this. One of the commentators said that he rearranged the furniture for writers. And another one said that, it's like he invented the process. He wasn't influenced by other people. Do you think he was that innovative in his writing?
I do think he was innovative. A lot of people, went on to imitate him. And, Tobias Wolff, I think, is the one who said that he rearranged the furniture in the room to, I guess, get away from lots and lots of exposition, and instead to try and capture the emotions and the action that's happening with a certain degree of understatement, so that it's something that the reader is feeling as they're reading along. Whereas, if you look at some of the novels that preceded him in, the 19th century, there's lots of, narrative, expository fireworks happening. And Hemingway wanted to see, well, what happens if I cut that stuff out? And that was one of his big innovations. It's also, I think, important to remember that he's one of many people who were doing innovative work at the time. So he is squarely in that modernist movement. So there were other books that were breaking down the boundaries of, what up till that point had been considered literature, and getting really experimental. And here, of course, I'm thinking of people, like Virginia Woolf and Juna Barnes and other modernists like that, who are, playing with stream of consciousness and nonlinear narrative. But the difference, I think, and this is one reason why Hemingway sometimes gets left out of conversations about modernism, his work also had this really broad popular appeal in the way that a novel by Juna Barnes didn't necessarily have. There are people who are in the know, and they're going to read the more experimental stuff. But Hemingway also was selling, lots of books, and he wanted that. He wanted popular success. He wasn't willing to, kind of compromise to have it, but he wanted to write serious literature that appealed to mass audiences. And that is kind of an innovative thing that he did as well, because he was successful at it. That's a really, that's a hard spot to hit, to have that popular success and that critical success at the same time.
Even when I read anything he wrote today, I'm amazed at how much he conveyed with such spare language. His declarative sentences were powerful, the way he arranged them. the interesting aspect of the Bach influence on his writing. Here's a long question. I'm going to put it on the screen. It'll probably cover our faces.
Okay.
I'm going to let you read it.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that question. What Hemingway was doing was trying to see if he could take a true subject, and I'm speaking here more about Green Hills of Africa. Take a true thing that happened, and write about it as if it were a novel, and make the true thing more interesting than it was when it actually happened. And he was trying to sort of just like describe actual events in a very novelistic way. And I think that this is this is a pretty new thing to do, because when it was time to sell these books, the Scribner's salespeople, they were given their dummy copies and their instructions, and they were not entirely sure what to tell the booksellers that this book was, because what is the precedent for this? And a lot of it comes from Hemingway's own education as sort of a self-taught person. So he went to high school. He had a high school education. He could have gone to college. He was very intelligent. He got good grades, but he didn't go to college. But he did read widely. He read extensively, and he would just absorb like more than one book a day. And he read fiction. He read popular literature. He also read nonfiction. And so when he's working on a book like A Farewell to Arms, like Green Hills of Africa, Death in the Afternoon especially, he's making use of a vast amount of other research. So he's not really citing his sources in the way that like we would tell our students, oh, if you use a source, you should cite it. Because he's writing about it as if it is literature, as if it's fiction. So he's just sort of incorporating all of that. And that is a lot of what seems to be happening in the field of creative nonfiction, where you talk to different people and you get your facts and you do your research, but then you put it all together in such a way that it reads more as a narrative, more literary. And, he's not the first person to ever do something like that. But he did, again, kind of help make that mainstream. And what Scribner's had a hard time classifying in the 1930s, now it'd be simple for us. We'd say, oh, this is creative nonfiction. And,
Yeah.
Now he sort of like was doing things before there was a label to describe them.
Right. So here's another question that I had. In the film, they frequently show you his handwritten manuscripts and the things he's crossed out and changed. And so my question is, do you think we've lost something in the writing process by working on computers?
I don't know that I can answer that question for anybody but myself. I do wonder what biographers are going to do in the future, because my remarks today, I took my notes in a Google Doc that saves automatically as I write. And so what this talk looked like a couple weeks ago when I first started thinking about it, and what it looked like today, very different. We don't have a record of that because I never did anything except type in the Google Doc.
Right.
So I don't know. Although I do know that every writer sort of has their own writing process, and actually it was Kurt Vonnegut who did a really good description of this. He said that there are two kinds of writers. There are those that like throw everything out on the page and then go back and fix it, and then there are the writers that like write line by line, and as they write, they're editing and they get it right the first time, and when they're done, they're done. I think the first type is more common. I'm of the second type. Like by the time, it takes me forever to write something, but when I finish it, there it is. And Hemingway was that second type as well. For the most part, he would read each day's work over, and then he would start writing where he had left off. He would go back and edit, but for the most part, things took shape for him in a fairly complete form. And his writing advice to young writers was, stop when you know what's going to happen next in your draft, and then you always have somewhere to pick up on. He used the metaphor of the well. You don't want to make the well go dry. But then, of course, there's always exceptions to anything. And I would say a big exception is some of his later work. And I focused today mainly on the 20s and 30s. If I had made this talk longer and gone all the way into the 50s, one of the points I wanted to make is that we think of Hemingway in the 1950s as being this sort of like celebrity who was just coasting on his own fame, and he had lost his mojo or whatever. And that's not really true. He was working in the 40s and 50s steadily on these works that later got published posthumously because he wasn't able to finish them in his life. And I think that those works were harder for him. He sits down to write the stories of In Our Time, and like I described, he sort of writes them and he goes back and makes some changes. But the manuscripts from later in his career are a lot more chaotic, a lot more rewriting, total revisions of pages in a way we don't see as much. He says he wrote The Sun Also Rises in 6 weeks. Farewell to Arms also came fairly steadily. He rewrote the ending, I think we said 47 times in the film and in the notes to the letters. But yeah, for the most part, it's nice to have that record of the edits that he made. But I don't know. He does offer some good writing advice for young writers. So that's another reason to read Hemingway. He can be kind of, instructive about editing.
If he had a thumb drive, though, he wouldn't have lost those manuscripts.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, that story, it could happen to anybody. I actually was editing a book of essays on Hemingway, teaching Hemingway and gender, and I spilled water on my computer when that book was like almost ready to go to the publisher. And for like 3 days, my laptop was in a bag of rice, and it was the only extant copy of like the fully edited manuscript. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done? That's when I started using Google Drive to write my drafts. I learned my lesson.
Yeah.
Not that I'm comparing anything I would have done to Hemingway's Lost Suitcase, but at the same time, I think that Lost Suitcase, good riddance. It's probably for the best.
Yeah. Well, unless someone else has a question, we'll end with this one, and we'll just deal with the elephant in the room, which is, the criticisms of Hemingway, that he's misogynist, that he's racist, maybe anti-Semite because of some of the things he wrote. What's your opinion on that?
I mean, it's undeniable that he says some really ugly things. And, that's something that the filmmakers dealt with a little bit in part one, and they'll deal with it in parts 2 and 3 as well. That's definitely there. There's the argument, he's a product of his time. He's just reflecting the time as it was. But, there's some anger there. There's some ugliness. And I think it's better not to try and apologize it away. One thing I would say, though, is that, as I said earlier, we bring a 21st century perspective to him, and that's going to come with different values. It also gives us an opportunity to find new ways of reading Hemingway that weren't available to his contemporary readers. And in the film, Edna O'Brien talks so beautifully about, Hemingway can write from this female perspective. And, we can see in his more experimental later work, this interest he had in gender fluidity and things like that. We could also bring perspectives of the new academic field of eco-criticism to his work, and think about, Ernest Hemingway and climate change. Even before climate change was known about, we can kind of see ways of understanding it in his work. So, I'm not going to say that he was a perfect person and we have to forgive him for these things, because, that is not true. There's some things that he writes that I find deeply offensive. But at the same time, I see him as being very instructive, and there's a lot of opportunities to learn from his writing and to apply our new perspectives on the world to what he gave us. And it does sort of, there are places where it seems dated, but there are places too where his writing really stands the test of time. And I think it continues to be worth reading and writing about.
Well said. I agree. Thank you, Dr. Kale, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Don't forget, people, to watch the 2 remaining episodes tonight and tomorrow night. And there's a book talk hosted by PBS, pbs.org, with the Librarian of Congress. Next week, again, the West Virginia 6th Cavalry in the Civil War in the West, Glenn Longacre will be here. Thank you again. Thanks for everyone who attended. Have a great day.